ahead and go talk about California snake safety. And what we're going to cover is basically some identification, bite prevention, and if that doesn't work for you, treatment. Hopefully that will work for you though. So there are 3 families of snakes in the US that are potentially venomous. We have colubrids, which are the common gopher snakes, king snakes, garter snakes. We don't worry about them too much. You have to let the things chew on your fingers for a while to have anything happen to you. So I'm not going to spend much time with them. Elapids are the cobra family. We do not have cobras in the US. We do have coral snakes, which are in that family. And then we have the viper family, which is the more familiar one with the rattlesnakes, copperheads, cottonmouths. So colubrids, as I mentioned, we're not going to spend much time because some of them do possess venom glands and some of them have fangs, but in the US, none of them are really dangerous. Elapids, those are the coral snakes. Unfortunately, in California, you don't have to worry about that either because they do not live here. You will have people argue, and I've had people that almost wanted to fight over this because they were positive they saw a coral snake and they're out riding in the desert in their bikes and there's a snake. And if anything, they usually know something about the couple mountain king snakes we have, which are tricolored. And there's the little rhyme, if it's red next to black, it's a friend of Jack. If it's red next to yellow, can kill a fellow. And that's usually about all they know. And that's how I know that they really haven't seen what they thought they saw because they don't really know snakes. So what they don't know is that rule does not apply to shovel-nosed snakes or long-nosed snakes or variable ground snakes. These are all things which can be found in California, and some of them are actually quite common in certain areas. And I'm positive that a lot of the coral snake sightings really were these. So I don't worry about them. They do live in Arizona. This is what coral snakes look like. The one on the upper left with the white, that is found just on the other side of the Colorado River. And for some reason, they never seem to find it on this side. So let's get to vipers. Rattlesnakes are vipers. And vipers are known by the large venom glands by the rear of the upper jaws. This creates that triangular shaped head that everybody's familiar with. They have long hollow fangs that can rotate back and forth on a hinge so that when not in use, the fangs tuck up underneath the roof of the mouth. One thing that vipers are known for is having a very strong proteolytic venom. That means it eats and digests proteins, which is mostly used for prey, but of course they can also use it for self-defense. And what that means is if they bite you and you receive venom, it's digesting you from the inside out. They are ovoviviparous, which means they're not really egg-laying, nor are they live-bearing. It's sort of in between. The mother retains the eggs in her body in a very soft membrane instead of a shell. And when they're ready to hatch, she produces them, and it does look very much like a live birth. They have elliptical pupils like cat eyes, and they have keeled overlapping scales, which produces a very textured look like this. And now we're going to narrow the group down a little bit. We're going to go to a subfamily. Crotalinae are pit vipers. So they are vipers that have these pits in the front of their face. These are not nostrils. The nostrils are actually above them, pointed away from us. So these pits are actually for heat sensing, and they do have night vision essentially. So they're called loreal pits because they're in the lores, which is the area between the eyes and the nostrils. But they're only one, that's only one specialty that snakes have in terms of their sensory apparatus. Pit vipers are really amazing. They take it to a whole nother level though. Yes, they have eyes like we do. They can see very well in daytime or night, but they have no ears, but they can still hear. And that's because their skull can produce sound. Essentially, the skull is formed from very thin splinter-like bones that will feel the vibrations in the air and direct them toward their inner ears. And it's extremely sensitive. And I have seen snakes shake their rattles and respond to dogs barking at a distance. So they really can hear, and they can also feel animals moving close by, like prey animals, for example. The other thing that's really cool is their tongue can smell the shape of something in front of them. It's unbelievable. Of course, you're going to wonder how that's possible. Well, they have the forked tongue, which we're all familiar with. The reason why they have a forked tongue is because they have a paired organ on the top of their mouth and the roof of their mouth. It's called Jacobson's organ, and their tongue pulls in particles from the air, and they can detect the tiniest differences of molecules on one side of their tongue as compared to those on the other side of their tongue. And as they frequently flick their tongue in and out, they're testing for change. They're looking for anything moving from one place to another. So essentially, they smell in stereo, which is really amazing. So on top of that, you have the pits that we mentioned earlier. That's at the lower right. And there have been tests done where they blindfold the snakes and cover up all the other abilities to sense as best they can. And they pass little warm objects on the end of a stick in front of a snake, and the snake can track it without using its eyes or anything. And they can strike it and deliver the right amount of venom, so they know exactly what size and shape the object is in front of them without their eyes. So they're pretty amazing animals. They can see all sorts of things in their environment that you cannot, that you are blind to. So pit vipers, as I mentioned, have this triangular head. The venom glands are on the sides right here. They're fairly large. And it's one of the most distinguishing features about a viper. They have this kind of a thin neck and the head really stands out. And probably the closest looking snake that you might mistake it for would be a gopher snake, like this one on the right. Gopher snakes tend to have cylindrical shaped heads. The eyes fit well within the line of the skull, whereas viper eyes kind of protrude up and out a little bit. And the gopher snakes have a wider neck, so it's really a different shape. However, you have to be careful because gopher snakes, when agitated, can put on a really good rattlesnake impersonation. So as you see here, the thing's just flattened out its head, looks like a triangle, looks just like a viper. And to somebody who doesn't know better, it can be very convincing. They'll strike, they'll hiss, they'll go ahead and put on a whole display. So I just tell people, when in doubt, of course, just leave it alone. Stand back a few feet and watch it. And the snake, in time, it's hard for them to maintain this shape. So eventually they'll go back to a normal gopher snake head. And from the side, it's really obvious. The eyes are round. Again, the vipers have this elliptical pupil, and the eyes stand up above the skull, whereas the gopher snake, the eyes are well within, and a much smoother scalation on the gopher. Venom apparatus is exactly what you would imagine. It's simply a venom gland and a compressor muscle that forces the venom through a duct and out through the long hollow fangs. And over on the right, you see this fleshy sheath that kind of covers the fangs. And what it does is it closes in and protects the fangs when the snake's not using them, when they're up against the roof of the mouth. So we're going to narrow down further. Many pit vipers are rattlesnakes. Not all of them are. For example, cottonmouth or water moccasins, copperhead. Those are not rattlesnakes, but they are pit vipers. They're very similar otherwise. So a rattlesnake is a pit viper that has a rattle because the scale at the end of the tail does not shed. When they shed their skin, everything comes off except for the very last scale. And that scale starts out as a point when they're young, and as they grow, it forms these wide portions that kind of interlock with each other. If you look on the right, you'll see how they're all actually conical and they fit well deep within this column. And basically they just produce one each time they shed. It really doesn't have to do with how old they are. It just has to do with how fast they grow. The faster they grow, the more they shed, and the more of these, the more buttons they put on the rattle. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bypass these sounds because on the next slide, I was worried it might not work, but we tested it out and it works. This I produced specifically for this program. And what I'm doing is I'm going to approach this snake, and what I'm doing with behind the camera is I'm opening and closing the fingers on my hand. And every time I open them, the snake gets a little bit alarmed. I don't normally harass snakes, but I wanted you to be able to see the difference in sound between the various states of agitation, and so you can be familiar with what you might hear in the wild. It varies quite a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and let the snake go. Notice the tongue as well, that's sampling the air. So you can see how sometimes it's a rattle, sometimes it's a buzz, and it all depends on how big the snake is and how agitated it is. The size of the rattle changes the sound, but mostly it's a matter of just the snake itself and its own behavior. So there are some really neat facts that we should know about them. First of all, rattlesnakes can strike roughly a distance of 2/3 their own length. So if you have a 3-foot long snake, you know that you have to be, giving it at least a couple feet of distance. But, realistically, we all know if you're 4 or 5, 6 feet tall, and you're leaning over and taking a photograph of the snake and you lose your balance, you're going to end up in its lap. So I always tell people a good 6 or 7 feet is safe enough, and you're perfectly fine. So, and I encourage people to watch them, because when you watch the snakes, you learn and you understand what kind of behavior they do. You learn what to worry about and what not to worry about based upon what they do in front of you. Snakes have no ears, as I mentioned, so they can feel vibrations to detect prey or nearby danger. I tell people, if you're in an area and you're kind of stomping around, at least you're letting a snake know that it has a chance to get away from you, perhaps. They do know you're there. They do hear you. And here's some really good stuff. Of the 7,000 to 8,000 venomous snake bites a year, only about 5 people ever succumb to them, which is really nice because those are good odds. And unless you're one of the 5 people, you're going to survive. You're going to do all right. The U.S. has a very good survival rate. We all have cell phones, we have antivenoms available, and we have hospitals. Many snake bites are dry bites, and dry bite means that they did not give you any venom. It's like a shot across the bow. They're warning you. And that's a very important thing to know, because later on when we talk about treatment, you'll hear about some horrendous things that some people do to themselves to try to save themselves from the venom, and they do more damage than the snake actually did. Here's an important thing at the bottom. Young snakes do not cause a more severe bite. This came out of a massive data collection effort by Loma Linda University Medical Center and in cooperation with their biology department. They had this multi-year study where they would take a patient that came in with a snake bite and record tons of information. They would measure the width of the fangs of the snake. They would determine how long it had been since the bite occurred and how far the symptoms had progressed. And then biologists would run out to the field where the snake was, collect a bunch of them, take venom samples, and basically create a venom profile that could then be connected with the symptoms. So they know snakes over here with this kind of venom cause that kind of problem. And they learned tons of stuff from them. So this thing right down here, the young snake thing, it's been long believed that small snakes or young snakes are more dangerous than big ones, because the theory is they don't have control over the venom and they give you all they had got. And so statistically, it did not bear out at all. The wider the snake fangs were, the more severe the bites were likely to be, which means the bigger snakes are more dangerous. This is a completely dispelled myth here. So let's look at some of the stuff that we have here in the state. I'm going to go around a little bit around the state so you can see. So for people who live elsewhere outside of the district, they can see what they have. This is the western rattlesnake. It's the most common one throughout the state. It lives up and down the coast and inland in some of the mountains, and pretty much anywhere except for a strong desert. It does not like the extremes of the desert. This is occurring in, we have 3 different subspecies, and they may be broken up. So one day it may be confusing, but these might be 3 different species. So when you look through the literature, it may be a little confusing at times. Locally, we refer to this in the Los Angeles area as the Southern Pacific rattlesnake. And north of Santa Barbara, you enter into Northern Pacific territory. And then there's one in Modoc and Mono counties that's known as the Great Basin. So this is, all 3 of them collectively should be treated as dangerous snakes. They do have a very potent venom. They have diamonds, which a lot of rattlesnakes do. They don't have to be a diamondback to have diamonds. And the ones locally can be distinguished from others by looking at the tail. Many rattlesnakes can be distinguished by looking at the tail. Locally, they have diamonds on their back, which kind of form rings as they approach the tail. And the tail is bright yellow in the youngsters. So it looks something like this. And the Southern Pacific one that we have in the Los Angeles area, the rings, you can see how the diamonds become rings, and then it just fades to a dark bland color. If you're north of Santa Barbara. The northern Pacific has rings that come all the way to the tail. So basically the tail is a really good place to focus. If you want to know what kind of snake it is, that's where you look a lot of times. Habitat is exactly what you'd imagine. This is typical California habitat. We have riparian woodlands, we have grassy areas, we have chaparral, rocky slopes, anything, like I said, that's not pure desert. These things are happy with. Now, if you move up into the high desert, on the desert floor, the most common rattlesnake, and perhaps even the most common snake, is the Mojave rattlesnake, often known as a Mojave green, but as you can see here, they're not always green. This snake is a very dangerous animal. This snake can kill people. I actually know somebody who was bitten by one, and he was in a remote area. He called for help, and they sent a helicopter. He was on life support, and while en route to the hospital, he suffered full cardiac arrest and was clinically dead. They were able to revive him, and I asked him what it was like to be killed by a rattlesnake, because, you know, how often do you get that opportunity? He said it was very much like watching the old TVs with the big tubes where you turn them off and the image would just shrink to a little tiny point and then it would just go bing, all gone. He said it was just like that. It was a little painful, he said, but that varies from one victim to another. They do not always, you don't always feel the pain with these snakes. Sometimes it's a pure neurotoxin, and what happens is the snake bites you and you don't feel anything. You think you have not been envenomated, and then later on you can suffer cardiac or pulmonary arrest. So always, always go to the hospital immediately if you see any blood with an interaction with this snake. The top of the head is different than other rattlesnakes in that it's got these big plate-like scales instead of the small granular scales like most rattlesnakes have, but I don't expect you to pick them up and look this closely. Again, pay attention to the tail. On the Mojave rattlesnake, the tail is really neat. It's just this bright, contrasted black and white banding, and it's the black bands are narrower, so it's really kind of black on white. And they have an extremely beautiful pattern. They really have a very nice diamond pattern. And in my opinion, I think it's one of the nicest looking of all the rattlesnakes in the country. And as you can see, it can be, you can have a Mojave green and you can have a Mojave not green. The color varies, and even in the same vicinity, you can see a lot of variation. Habitat is what you'd imagine for high desert. This is creosote scrub and Joshua tree woodland. And during the heat of the day, you'll find these things in the shade of any of these plants right here. Also in the desert, we have the sidewinder, and this is in the high and low deserts. These are not very big. They're fairly small rattlesnakes. We have two different subspecies for high and low desert, but regardless, nevertheless, they're still sidewinders, and they're kind of a cool snake. They're built for sand, and they have a pale coloration that matches the sand. They have these neat little horns over their eyes. This is the supraocular scales that cover the eyes. And in their case, they kind of come up in these little points, form these little ridges. There's a sidewinding motion that they're famous for. And they often hide beneath the sand with only their eyes visible. And this is where you have to be careful if you're on a sand dune habitat, because they can disappear almost entirely. And what they're doing is they're waiting for a small animal to come by. They'll find an area where they suspect there's been rodent or lizard activity and they bury themselves. So keep your eyes open. You usually see a little kind of depression that looks like a little circular depression, you know, with them. There may or may not be a snake because they use one, then they leave it, and it looks pretty much the same whether the snake's in there or not. Unless you actually see the animal itself, it's hard to tell. They have a peculiar shape. This it's a triangular shaped snake. It's very flat on the bottom and kind of peaked at the top of the back. The pattern's very kind of plain, little saddles, nothing really distinct. And the tail has little dark blotches. There's nothing really stripy about it, so to speak. They're the little horns over the eyes. And this is a good picture to see the nostrils in the front and the pits right behind them. Habitat is, like I said, typically sand. When they go to sleep for the winter, they'll sometimes seek a rockier area, but when they're active during the warm season, they're on a sandy habitat usually. And these are their tracks. And I do have a video. And you'll notice they look very much like they're gliding when they're sidewinding. That's because very little of their body's actually in contact with the ground at one time. Most of it's elevated a little bit. So very much it's like doing kind of like a moonwalk or shuffle dancing. And the cool thing is they can go any direction they want without changing their position, without turning around. So they could face you and they can come at you or backward or sideways or whatever they want. It's really a neat motion to watch. Also in the desert, we have speckled and Panamint rattlesnakes. These were several years ago considered to be the same species, and they've been split up into two. And as you can see, it divides north and south. Pretty much everything north of Highway 15 is the Panamint rattlesnake. And then below that, you have the speckled, which is in high desert, but also ventures into low desert. These snakes are very similar. They're built for rocks, and they look like rocks, and they blend very well into the rocks. And the tail is not very distinct. It's kind of a little dark and light, blotchy bands, kind of messy looking. But you see how the snakes really look like the rocks that they're around. They look like granite or sandstone or whatever they need. And they blend very well. So they're a little nervous. I would tell people when you're out in the desert, you know, if you stop the car and you let the kids run out and climb up the little rocky outcrop, be very careful, because they're not going to come at you, but they do get startled and they will bite. And so watch where you put your fingers and toes. So when you go to reach for something, see what's there first, because if the snake just suddenly sees a hand coming at it, it will bite. Now we go down to the low desert. Okay, so this is your Coachella Valley, Imperial County, and everything going south and east from there. The most common snake on the desert floor is the Western Diamondback. And this snake does not occur in the same place as the Mojave. It's amazing. It's like you could draw a line. There's high desert, low desert, and they don't mix until they get to Arizona. But in California, this is what you're going to see in the low desert. These guys get fairly large. They can get over 7 feet long. And Western Diamondbacks, to say that they are bold and likely to stand their ground is almost an understatement. I would say give this one more than 6 or 7 feet distance if you want to watch it, more like 10 or 12. This is the only snake that I have ever had, the only species that I've ever had actually chase me. And they will not do that if they have an out, if they think they can get away. But if they feel that you are pursuing and they know that you're faster than they are, they will turn around and they will face you, and they will be more than happy to have it out with you. It's quite intimidating when they do that. So they have a tendency to lift their body off the ground, elevate themselves. This is what they're showing when they're upset. If you see this, that means the snake has decided it cannot escape from you, so it's going to fight. And it will raise itself up like this. It will pull its head and neck back in the ready position. And so that's when, like I said, you just don't want to advance. At that point, you back off. The tail is really strongly banded, much more so even than the Mojave rattlesnake. It has strong dark and light banding, usually 4 or 5 bands. And some people call it a coon-tailed rattlesnake in some areas because of that. You notice it has kind of a messy pattern, not nearly as clean as a Mojave rattlesnake, for instance. But anyway, this is what you want to watch out for. I do not see these in Palm Springs. I think it's more like south toward Indio, where you begin to find these, and from there east toward Arizona. Typical habitat is what you would see in those areas. It's fairly sparsely populated with vegetation, or humans for that matter. But when you get to the west side, if you take the San Jacinto Mountains and go toward the Pacific Ocean, you get this one, which is a very similar snake, and it's very closely related, and yet it's an entirely different snake in attitude. The red diamond rattlesnakes are very mellow, very shy. You could approach them and sit and watch them to your heart's content, and they'll just sit there and watch you back. It's really interesting. They inhabit any kind of mountainous habitat in that area, pretty much starting from pure desert and working their way over the mountains to where it becomes greener. Then you get to the Pacific side, you get the chaparral. I'm told that they really like to rest in these prickly pear patches. So those are all of the snakes, the rattlesnakes you're likely to find in California. Anything else? I've had people tell me they've seen this, that, and the other, and I don't really think there are introduced other snakes. I think they're just mistaking what they're watching, so that's it. Bite prevention is all about knowing what snakes do, taking the precautions, and please don't do anything silly beyond that. Knowing the snake means this, not just what they're capable of, but what are they likely to do? And that's why I tell people, watch them. When you find them, it's okay. Sit and observe. The animals are very predictable. If you sit and watch a snake for a certain amount of time, chances are the next time you see one, it's going to be doing the same thing. They do like mild, warm weather. Basically, the weather that you like, they like. When you step outside and say, this is a really nice day, it's nice and warm, it's not too hot, it's not too windy, that's exactly what they like. They might be found in hot weather or cold weather, but chances are, if that's the case, they're probably seeking shelter of some sort. And they seek shelter also from predators as well when they're resting. So taking refuge means a couple things to a snake. Means a few things. First of all, if you're going to be down for the winter or during the heat of the summer, you'll look for something more substantial, like these big piles, and they'll disappear into there because they know that they're safe from predators. Nothing's going to bother them. If you go and move a stack of wood, that's when you want to be careful, wear gloves and watch what you're doing, because that's where these are going to be during the more extreme weather. Now, days and weeks, that's a short-term refuge, which is what they typically do during the active season. So they come out and they find something like this wooden board, a log, and it doesn't have to be very big. All it is something that they can rest in while they're in between going out and hunting. And so they find an area that has rats, mice, whatever they want, water, and they will kind of stay there as long as those things are there. So they're not territorial, but as long as they can find food and water and anything else they want, they will continue to use this same spot. And this snake down here on the left, we observed this one for 3 years. It went down that little gopher hole next to it and disappeared during the winter, and it would come back up in the summer and sit underneath that board. And eventually, at some point, it got bigger and decided there wasn't enough food to sustain it, and then it moved on. Then there's the very short term, and this is what I think is most critical. This is where people get in trouble, especially if you live on the outside, on the outskirts of a community where you have wildlife nearby. What they're looking for is anything that provides shade. So they move around at nighttime or in the evening, in the morning, and then when the sun comes up and it gets hot, they look for anything that provides shade for the middle of the day. It could be a bush, it could be something you set in the backyard, something that you stored for a while, children's play toys, houses, whatever. If it gives them a spot that they feel a little bit safe and out of the sun, they will use it. And anything goes, really. I always like throwing this picture up here on the left because people laugh, but then I have to explain to them that I actually did share some quality time in one of these with a sidewinder once. I went in there, and by the time I was committed, the sidewinder, I noticed it there. And it worked out okay. We just kind of kept to our corners, and we both left when we were both ready to. So yeah, keep your eyes open pretty much all the time, especially in the heat of the day when these things are looking for anything to hide in. Precautions. This is where I tell people everything that I do to go look for these animals is the opposite of what you want to do if you want to avoid them. I just flip the script here. So I go look in tall grass and brush, rocky areas, fallen logs. These snakes are using all these things to, kind of maneuver throughout the environment without being too visible. So you're going to want to watch where you step. If you sit on a log to rest, watch the shady side of the log to see if there's something under there. This is very important. Wear loose, long pants and good leather boots or rubber boots, something that's substantial, and thick gloves if you're going to pick up anything. This comes from that study also from Loma Linda. They noticed that people who were coming in with snake bites that that were wearing shorts and didn't have any barrier between their skin and the snake had a much greater severity to the bite on the average. And so they tested it out. They took a prosthetic leg that they were able to extract the venom from, and they offered the leg to snakes, and the snakes would bite the leg, and then they would sometimes put denims over the leg. And what they discovered was that when there is that fabric in between, the snake tends to deliver only 1/3 of the amount of venom on the average that it would have had there been nothing in between the snake and your skin. So it's a very important thing because, 1/3, it could be the difference between life and death or losing a limb. And of course, if you're in tall grass, especially if you're conducting vector control, for example, you can use your mosquito dipper or anything, but tall grass and leaf litter. Just, check what's in front of you. And when possible, just walk on a clear path. If it's just dirt that's very visible, you can see what's going on in front of you, and that's the safest way to move. And if you have toys and obstructions in front of you that you need to flip over, something you need to check, use a stick or an object or a dipper to do that. At nighttime, if you're out at night, if I'm going to look for snakes and I want to guarantee my likelihood is very high of finding a rattlesnake, I will look for concrete or asphalt. That's because the sunlight hits it in the daytime, warms it up, and then at nighttime, it radiates heat for quite a while after sundown. Snakes see that, they go over to it and they rest on it to warm up before they go hunting. So take a flashlight with you at night and make sure you watch really carefully when you can watch whether you're on dirt or not, but definitely on asphalt or concrete, that's where they rest. And of course, never handle a venomous snake, alive or dead. It is not a myth. It is absolutely true. If a snake has been freshly killed, they do have a bite response and they can still envenomate somebody who handles them. This is an interesting study. I like this one. This is 11-year period of 282 patients. And a few things on the top, male victims outnumber female. Most of those are like, yeah, whatever, so what? Maybe little boys play in places where snakes are more often than little girls. I don't know. But what's interesting is the part down below. 44% of the injuries were considered accidental, which is kind of funny because I'd never met anybody who's been envenomated by a snake who told me they did it deliberately. So I'm not quite sure even what that means. 57% have been handling the snake. And the funny thing is, if you add those two together, you get 101%, which means that somebody somehow thought they were, I don't know, accidentally handling a snake. I'm not quite sure how that works. So those are kind of meaningless, but funny. The bottom is what counts. 85% fingers and hands, 13% feet and ankles. So that's what you want to protect. You do not need to have a suit of armor to give yourself much better odds. All you need are good shoes, preferably boots if you're going to be in snake territory, and long pants, and use gloves if you lean over to pick up something. And that alone, just regular things that you can buy in any store, will protect you greatly. It's not 100%. It's not going to keep you from getting something from the snake if the snake really tries, but it will severely reduce the likelihood of you getting a really bad bite. So for treatment, 911 is the best thing you can do. We're fortunate to live in a country where a lot of us have cell phones and cars, and we have hospitals all over the place. So very few people, like I said earlier, very few people die from snake bite here. And that's because we have all these things, established for us. On the way to the hospital, if somebody's bitten, preferably someone else drives. Try to keep them calm. It's very difficult. I've known people that were very calm and got bitten by snakes and they were not calm. So I know it's difficult, but keep the extremity that's bitten at a neutral position relative to the heart. So if it's in your hand and you're sitting up, rest it on the headrest, or just lie down in the back seat if somebody's driving. Remove anything that is tight because swelling will occur, especially in the area of the bite. So shoes, jewelry, tight clothing, anything, or especially rings. If you get bitten on a hand that has a ring, you want to take that ring off as soon as possible. Otherwise, you'll constrict your blood flow. The bottom one here, the last part with the identification, I don't know if that's, I have mixed feelings on that one. I think you should identify the snake if you're not positive that it's a rattlesnake. If you get bitten by something and you're really not sure, maybe it's a baby snake that doesn't have a complete rattle yet, sure, take a picture. Maybe that can identify whether or not it's worth worrying about when you get to the hospital. But most importantly, get to the hospital as soon as possible. Do not waste time. If you know you could be bitten by a rattlesnake, any kind of venomous snake, just go to the hospital. Don't worry about taking a picture because what they give you at the hospital is going to be the same thing they give you, whether it's this rattlesnake or that one. Doesn't matter. They're going to give you the same thing. They're going to observe you for whatever kind of symptoms. So whether it's a really dangerous one or a really mild type of snake, doesn't matter. They're going to treat you the same way. Time is tissue. That's what they say. The more time you waste, the more of your body is being dissolved. you want to go there as soon as possible. So that in mind, don't try to kill or capture the snake. It's just wasting time and may risk getting bitten further. Don't use a tourniquet or make cuts or incisions. None of that really works very well. And like I said, snakes may not give you any venom at all when they bite you, and people end up hurting themselves further with this. Don't suck the venom out with your mouth because it doesn't make a difference. It's not a significant amount of venom. And if you have canker sores or something, you'll become envenomated in your mouth. Do not take aspirin or ibuprofen. These are blood thinners. Venom is blood thinner, so you don't want to help the venom. Antihistamines are okay. Benadryl is good. Some people suffer severe allergic reactions to the bite, and it's okay to administer something like that. Do not apply electric shock, drink alcohol, or place ice on the wound. All these things, there are many, many things that people think is going to help them, and all it does is waste time. So what is venom? Venom is a toxin. Actually, in the case of snakes, it's a multitude of toxins. When a snake bites you, it's not just one thing, it's a cocktail. And so when it's injected into the victim, it's called venom. Poison is something that's consumed, inhaled, or touched. So that's why we refer to these as venomous snakes, not poisonous snakes. So a poisonous snake would be one that, for example, an animal tried to eat and it got sick because it wasn't supposed to be able to eat it. So maybe it had poison in its skin or something to prevent it from being eaten. That's the difference. So to summarize it, if the snake bites you and you get sick, it was venomous. If you bite the snake and you get sick, it was poisonous. And some are both. Crofab is and has been for the last couple of decades the most popular antivenom. And it's produced by this company called BTG. And essentially what they do is they take sheep and they inject them with a sublethal dose of venom from these 4 species, the eastern diamondback, western diamondback, Mojave, and water moccasin. And then they obtain the antibodies from the sheep and they mix them together, and then they fractionate, they break the antibody up. And the reason they do this is because it can cause very severe allergic reactions. It has in the past. And so what happens is they use papain, which is an enzyme from papaya, to cut these arms off. So this is an antibody shaped like the letter Y, more or less. And the work gets done at the top. These arms up here grab the venom and essentially prevent it from doing harm and help assist it outside of your body safely. The tail end of the antibody is what caused the majority of those allergic reactions. So the papain cuts the arms off and then they extract the tail end and remove it from the mix so that by the time it ends up being used for somebody, you're not going to have that part of it within the mix, and it's a much safer product now than it used to be. So Loma Linda, what they do is they have, this is one of the probably the most experienced facilities in pit viper envenomation treatment, and a lot of people follow them. And what they do is, initially they give you 4 to 6 vials of Crofab if they detect any kind of symptoms involving envenomation. And then they watch what happens. And if it continues, if the symptoms continue, they repeat that until they begin to see a response. And once they find a response, they'll follow it up with several more doses just to be sure. So typically an envenomation will involve at least 10 vials of Crofab or so, and maybe more. Now, historically, it was believed by many, and still is to this day, that Crofab is not very effective against the bite of the southern Pacific rattlesnake, the one that's common here in Los Angeles and San Diego and Santa Barbara. This animal, it was widely believed that it was not effective, and that was a horrible thing because it occurs where one of the most dense populations of humans are in California, and the snake itself is very common, so the likelihood of bite is very high here. But all this was based upon a study that was conducted by the makers of Crofab, because the FDA wanted them to prove that this material would work as well for other species of snakes besides the ones that it was made from. And so they did the study and they came out with this little table here. The package insert, when you open up, when you get medications, they have that little insert in this little piece of paper and you unfold it 20 million times and then you have all this fine writing in there that tells you all about it. This table was included in there. And what it showed was this this test they did where they injected mice with venom and antivenom to see how effective it was. What they showed is right here, Helleri, that's the southern Pacific rattlesnake, required far more antivenom to cure essentially 50% of the mice in each group from the venom. And that's a huge difference. And so that's what people picked up on and cued on. And then from there, anecdote started happening. And so every time there was a really bad bite, they would say, see, there you go. This guy took 50 vials of antivenom. And that's because it doesn't work very well in the snake. Well, what they weren't doing is they weren't looking at all the people that did not need a whole lot of antivenom. And they just wrote that off as being a mild snake bite. They didn't give them very much venom, maybe. But medical doctors were not finding that to be the case. So what happened is they, again, went back to the study with Loma Linda, and they demonstrated statistically, if you include all the cases where people did not require a lot of antivenom, it averaged out the same as everything else, as every other snake. So they passed that information on to BTG, and in 2012, a new table appeared, and it shows Helleri, the Southern Pacific, right among everything else, not standing out whatsoever. So to this day, you will run into people who will tell you they are snake experts, and they will insist that this product does not work for the snake, and it does. It absolutely has been demonstrated statistically, and if anybody wants to argue with you, tell them to call Loma Linda, but it works perfectly fine. So this is the problem. The problem is the cost. This product, it wholesales for $3,200 per vial. And of course, the medical institution that treats you is going to have their markup. And Loma Linda is $9 grand per vial. And some places it's as high as 20 grand. And keep in mind, typical treatment's going to be 10 vials or more. And that can add up really fast. So there was a patient recently who took more than 60 vials. And that didn't even include the cost of the hospitalization and the treatment. But there was this little boy who was a scout up in Santa Barbara, got bitten on the ankle, and it cost $500,000. So what happens here is your insurance company typically argues and says, no, we're not going to cover that. And you have to hire an attorney and sue them. And then they have to deal with the makers of CroFab and the hospital and everything. It goes back and forth all over the place. I know a family that this happened to, and it took them the better part of a year to settle. And during that time, they were seriously concerned that they might lose their house and everything they owned. Fortunately, there was an agreement, and the insurance company covered the majority of it. But the worst thing about being bit by a snake nowadays is not the bite, it's the cost. So other alternatives. Yes, there is another company now in Mexico that's producing a product. So as I mentioned, CroFab uses papain to cut the shear the arms off of the antibody. And there's a company in Mexico called BioClone, and they produce a product that not only costs less than CroFab, but it works slightly differently. They use pepsin, which cuts off the arms but retains the little bridge in between. So it's a larger molecule. In theory, this takes longer to remove from your body, so it persists longer and does a more complete job. So potentially we have a product that costs less and actually may work better. So they wanted to bring this product to the US market, and when they did, BTG sued them. So that lawsuit went on until a point at which I guess the judge decided, yes, they're similar processes, but they're not exactly the same. So what happened is they came to an agreement that as of October 2018, they've been allowed to sell the product here in the US. And for the first 10 years, BTG will receive a royalty. After that, it'll be a competition. So who knows, maybe there's an opportunity that this stuff will come down in price a little bit. But until then, all I can say is the best advice is just don't get bitten. So these are all the people I'd like to thank that contributed greatly. I had access to top-notch people that work in this field, and I'm very grateful to them for that. And if anybody's interested, there are a few resources if you want to know more about the animals that live here. There's a great website, californiaherps.com, has tons of photographs of all these things from all over the state. And geographic range maps, other information. You can see the photographs of the ones in Riverside County because they might differ from the ones where you live, for example. Great place to start. There's a field guide, online field guide, Schechter's Reptiles and Amphibians. The cool thing about this is you can have it set up so that GPS figures out where you are when you see an animal, and it eliminates all the other animals in the field guide except for the ones that you're likely to find right there, which narrows it down. And then my all-time favorite is iNaturalist. There's an app for this as well. This is like Pokemon Go, but for like real live living animals. And you can photograph even plants, fungi, anything that's alive. You photograph it, it goes up to the database, and you've got a permanent record of everything that you have ever seen and uploaded. And the cool thing about that is if there's ever any plant or animal that you'd like to see that you haven't, you can find out what other people have seen and where they found it, and you can follow them and look on the map and find a dot that will tell you right where to go. So all these are great resources if anybody wants to learn about reptiles, amphibians, or anything else really in the state of California or elsewhere in the world. These are a great place to start. So that's it. I'm going to open it up. If anybody has questions, feel free to shoot. And I think I will unshare at this point unless you know how to do that for me. Here we go. So Yesenia, do you want to handle the questions or just let them fly?
Does anyone have any questions for Randy?
There are some questions in the chat box.
Let's see. First question.
Oh, there we go.
How long is a hospital stay if infected with venom? Injected with venom, sorry about that.
That varies greatly depending on the amount of venom and the response. Everybody has a different reaction. I had a friend who was bitten by a sidewinder, and it was a 2-week stay. That was back when these horrendous allergic reactions would occur. And so 1 week was really recovering from the snake bite, and the second week was, recovering from the allergy. That's not as big an issue today. So I would guess probably it doesn't take as long unless you get a bad bite. I do know people though who lost tissue and had to have reconstruction done. And of course their stay was much longer.
Awesome, thank you, Randy. Let me look at the chat, see if there's any more questions.
Would icing have any benefits?
Yes.
I know that people have done this a lot in the past and it was believed to be the case, but all the medical researchers and doctors that I've spoken to about this said it's not worth the wait, whatever, maybe if you have something on the way to the hospital, but for the most part, it's not significant enough to make a difference to go out of your way for it.
Okay, and the next one, who should we call if we encounter a rattlesnake in private property?
Oh, that's a tough one. I used to know somebody who was the right person, and I would always give them his name. He passed away about a month and a half ago. So I'm now looking for people. There are people out there. Usually people call the fire department. You could do that. And chances are they will just come and kill the snake because they don't necessarily have somebody who's a snake person. So they just kill it. So there's that. But I think if you were to go online and look for snake handlers in your area, you will probably come up with a number of people, just because I know from Facebook chats that there are people who are familiar with snake handling and will be more than happy to go and remove them for you.
Okay, thank you for that. How common do snakes bite dogs?
I don't have any stats on that. I do know that there are 2 things you can do if you're concerned with that. There is a vaccine for snake bite. I'm not sure how effective it is. I know that it's designed for certain types of snakes. For example, up here in Antelope Valley, we have different snakes than the one product that's most popular. is used for. It probably will not work on the Mojave rattlesnake, but I believe it's effective to some degree for others, Southern Pacific rattlesnake. Even so, they still tell you take the dog to the vet. It's not going to cure the dog necessarily. It probably buys it time. And the other thing is there is snake avoidance training. You can look that up on the internet. I know there are at least a couple people in the area that actually will train your dog to not get near a snake, which is very helpful.
All right, thank you. I have a couple of more questions from the chat. Do you know if biting incidents have increased over the years, or have they fairly remained the same?
That I don't really know. I haven't heard anything specifically about it, so I would guess that probably there's nothing significant to report in that respect. Mostly it's just one of those things where, it happens a lot during the, early summer, late spring. Snakes are coming out, and it's areas that are communities that are new communities that are developing in areas where there's wilderness. That's where I personally hear about most of the encounters where somebody gets bitten. So that's the best I could tell you on that.
Okay. Next up, what attracts snakes into the yard or a house, into a backyard?
Objects to hide under. Anything that's that looks like nice spots for shade. Certain snakes are more apt to come to your yard. Mojave rattlesnakes, I've never seen one go into a yard. They can have habitat across the street, and they don't seem to want to leave it. They like the shrubbery that they're used to. Southern Pacific rattlesnakes will come right up and sit in your doorstep. So there's no foolproof way, because when they're moving, and if you're near the outskirts of town, they'll be there. But if you have objects lying around, if you have kitty toys, play centers, anything that provides a space, if you stack wood, better to stack it flush to the ground than to elevate it and leave that little space underneath there, because they will use that.
Thank you, Randy. Is there any further questions?
Do I have more of a chance of running across a rattlesnake in the area that the valley handles, or Santa Fe Springs?
I think it doesn't really matter if you're out in habitat anywhere. Just if you're in town and there's a lot of concrete and asphalt and not a lot of habitat, you're not likely to run into anything. But anywhere you are that's near the outskirts, it's fair game.
Okay, I have a couple more that in the chat. Why are snakes worth keeping around? Can you answer that?
Well, they're excellent rodent control, for one thing. And, the vast majority of them are not really dangerous, and the dangerous ones don't want to bite us. I have had at least 3, maybe 4 instances where I was out hiking and accidentally landed a body part very close to a rattlesnake. When I noticed it, in each case, I could have been bitten. And each time the snake simply decided to sit still and hope that I didn't notice it and that I would go away. So it's really rare. It does happen, but it's very rare that somebody, it just happens to be going somewhere, planting something in the garden or whatever, and then they get bitten by a snake. The vast majority of times it's people that see the snake and want to pick it up, play with it, or show off, or just, get too close while they're observing it. So, they really are beneficial though, as predators. They can go places and get things that you don't want, like rodents in your yard. And so I think they're nice to have around, so long as they're not putting anybody in danger.
Thank you. What kind of snakes are pet snakes? Are could be kept as snakes? As pets,
As
sorry.
pets. Yeah, you're asking the wrong person, because I know everybody that's kept every kind of snake there is, and most of them should probably not be kept as pets. There are some very good ones, though. There are snakes that are bred in captivity. They're literally domestic animals, for all purposes, because they don't look or behave like the ones in the wild anymore. There are things like ball pythons. Ball pythons are very commonly bred, and there are all sorts of morphs, forms that are really beautiful and that don't occur in the wild. They are really a domestic animal. And you can find all sorts of things that are fairly gentle, easy to handle. You know, a good, I don't know, I hate to use the word beginner pet for kids. But yeah, there are a number of snakes, and if you just go online and look at snakes for sale, and especially at pet stores, you're going to find things that breeders are working with, and they've been in captivity for many generations, and they're much easier to handle and take care of than the ones in the wild.
All right, thank you, Randy. I believe if anyone doesn't have any more questions, I don't see any questions on the chat. That concludes this presentation. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation, and that concludes this presentation. Thank you.
You're welcome.